thank you for being here. It's kind of a spooky night. It's a nice night. It was nice earlier, but it's a little, I just noticed walking outside, a little cool and windy, and it's kind of a pre-Halloween night. And at morning assembly for the school children here at St. Monica's on Monday, oh, hello, welcome, come on in. Pardon? That's all right. Yeah. So welcome to all, and as I was mentioning when I spoke with the school children on Monday morning of this week, we talked about how this is a transitional time. You know, remember just a short time ago it was so hot, and it's like summer is still here. Of course, that's our late summer here in San Francisco, especially the Richmond district. And then it seems in a very short period of time, the darkness of winter comes. And we're in between those two worlds of summer and winter. That's what autumn really is. And autumn is, of course, the time of the harvest. And so Halloween is a combination of these various themes. It's really a combination of a lot of different feelings, emotions, traditions, themes throughout the centuries, encompassing a variety of different cultures. And so the juxtaposition of times and seasons, of summer and winter, being in that liminal, in-between state, that gateway state, the autumn, the season of harvest, all of those came together especially for the Celts in ancient Celtic spirituality. They brought those two themes together. And so the idea was that the harvest is really over, or almost over, by the end of October, and the beginning of November begins this move towards what? The darkness of winter, slowly, step by step. In fact, this year, daylight savings time ends on November 1st. So we begin with, you know, this is going to be really dark by a week from today. And so the end of the harvest was a time when the ancient Celts saw themselves at an end point, having to gather, having to collect the harvest, which had to hold them over through the winter. At the winter, that's it. There's no more harvest. So what you have stored is all you've got, because the winter is a time, a cold time, a frozen time, an inert time in terms of harvest. You have to live off whatever you have from the harvest. And so it's that in-between time that we celebrate the end of harvest and the beginning of pre-winter, October 31st and November. In fact, the Celtic word for November is Samhain. And so the Celts developed the Feast of Samhain, and a whole spirituality developed around that. And there's this marvelous kind of Celtic imagination. You know, they reflect upon the seasons, as farmers do. They don't just experience it, you know, they reflect upon their experience and develop kind of rich insights and celebrations and customs and traditions regarding it. And so they began to meditate upon the nature of harvest and the nature of winter, not just from a seasonal perspective, but from a spiritual perspective, what the seasons tell us about ourselves. They began to see winter as somehow an end time for ourselves, the limitations of our life, mortality, human mortality, for the individual, for the farmer, for the whole village. And they saw this and celebrated this in terms of a gateway time, an in-between period between light and darkness, again, between summer and winter, between life and death. A period, especially the period between October 31st and Samhain, the beginning of November, where the boundary between these realities, and especially the boundary between life and death, was thinner and thinner and thinner. And so in their collective imagination, the Celts began to celebrate this access to the dead, to the spirits of the dead, who at this time were floating about, were accessible, were more present than normal. And so there's this move from the end of harvest to a contemplation on winter and the theme of light and darkness, life and death, that leads to an understanding of this being a gateway time. And the spirits of the dead are present, and the spirits of the dead arise, the spirits of the dead again are accessible. And in the collective unconscious of human beings, of all times and ages and cultures it seems, there's both an attraction to this gateway, to this transitional state, season, and a fear of it as well. The fear of mortality, the fear of death, an attraction to my relatives coming back, as it were, and at the same time a fear. What is it to be visited in a positive way, and what is it to cross the line over into being haunted? And so there developed the custom of various Celtic celebrations that are the precursor of our modern day Halloween. If the spirits are abroad, somehow they're restless. And if they're restless, they can be restless for good or restless for mischief. And even mischief towards haunting. And how avert mischief or haunting? Well, in a very primitive culture and consciousness at the time, the idea was get some of that harvest, get some of the food, get some of the goodies, and put them out on the front door, or even further out beyond the village, so that will distract the souls of the dead and keep them away from entering my house and my family, disturbing me and my family. And then if you leave the house, you don't want to be recognized as alive, so dress up as the dead. So masquerade. And from that came different traditions in Ireland and Britain, two of which are, again, precursors to modern-day Halloween. The first is souling, S-O-U-L-I-N-G. Souling meant that you went out, kids especially would do this, and they would sing for what was called soul bread, or soul cakes. And in return for getting those soul cakes, not only singing for them, they would promise to pray for the departed. And the other thing was called guising, I should say, from which we get the word disguise, where you would dress up in a manner either of the dead or of a costume at least that disguised your identity, and you would sing or perform lyrics or a play or something of that sort in exchange for food, money, candy, etc. And these are ancient practices. And so you can begin to see the interweaving of various Celtic practices, ancient British and Irish practices that lead to this notion of Halloween. At the same time, in Roman society, there were similar celebrations going on. There was the feast of Lemuria, which was celebrated on on May 13th, actually from 11, 12, 13th. It ended on May 13th. And that was a feast similar to the Celtic understanding of a period of time where the dead were somehow rising and present and could be a positive presence, but more often than not were experienced as mischief-making, if not haunting, and in need of an exorcism. And so there are various, again, these are pagan rites of exorcism during this ancient Roman feast. At the same time, on or around November 1st, was the feast of Pomona. And Pomona was the ancient Roman goddess of the harvest, of fruits, fruit trees and nuts and, apples. And so they would celebrate this feast with wild parties and what we would now call, big celebration, a big party, a Halloween party, bopping for apples. It goes back centuries and centuries to this time. So you begin to see how multicultural, multi-layered, and ancient our so-called modern celebration of Halloween really is. So cultural historians look at all of this, and scholars, liturgical scholars, look at all of this, and some of it is controversial in terms of the interrelationship between the pagan and the Christian celebrations. My own personal belief is that it's hard not to see, however controversial some liturgists or historians might find this, it's certainly not hard to see some interplay between the two. Certainly, in the beginnings of the Christian faith, these pagan celebrations that were already over 1,000 years old are not going to disappear because a bishop or the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, says so. And so Pope Gregory I, St. Gregory the Great, and other missionaries, evangelizers felt it's best to baptize, somehow sanctify, Christianize these ancient festivals and the feelings behind them, rather than just try to eradicate them by force. And again, what we're dealing with are two interrelated celebrations: the end of autumn, the beginning of winter, and this sense of this being a gateway to access to the dead, and how one responds to the presence of the spirits of the dead in our midst. In terms of that feast of Lemuria, on May 13th, which was celebrated in Rome, the Pope at the time, Boniface IV, in the early 10th century, about 910, in the early 7th century, around 610, decided to take this festival, which was still part of Roman culture somehow. Even though the church had been established for some time, it was still in the collective historical consciousness. And he decided to take this idea of struggling with the dead, the notion of the dead, how do we respond to the dead, and make it a celebration of the dead, specifically the martyrs. So you see the transference from just vague spirits, a pagan concept of spirits floating around, to, no, from the Christian perspective, people who have died bearing witness to the faith. And so he establishes essentially a new feast through, I believe it was 610, when he dedicated the Pantheon, or reconsecrated it, dedicated it as a church, under the title of Our Lady, the Mother of God, and all of the martyrs. Notice the transition. Suddenly we're focusing on the martyrs, those who have borne witness to the faith, i.e., all of the Christian dead, but specifically martyrs. A century or so later, Pope Gregory III, in around 730 or so, establishes, Oh, and by the way, Boniface IV dedicated the Pantheon under this title to all the martyrs on May 13th, which was again the Feast of Lemurs in Roman culture. So he takes this focus on the dead and having to exorcise their spirits and transfers it, a subtle transference. You're still talking about the dead, but now not departed malevolent spirits, but the martyrs, and our celebration of them within a Christian context, those who bore witness to the gospel by giving up their lives. Then a century later, in 730, Pope Gregory III he takes it beyond the martyrs and establishes the Feast of All Saints. So all those who have died, all of those who are the blessed in heaven, are now commemorated in the Latin West. And he takes the feast that his predecessor, Boniface IV, had established of all martyrs, extends it to All Saints, and moves it from May 13th to what? November 1st. What's November 1st? Celtic Samhain. These aren't just arbitrary, this isn't just coincidence. They're obviously evangelizing, baptizing, sanctifying already existing pagan Celtic and Roman feasts and notions behind them. So the idea then is to celebrate all of the saints, whether officially recognized, canonized, or not. About a century later then, in the 840s, sometime around there, that local Roman feast will be extended to the universal Latin liturgical calendar, the Roman Church, by Gregory IV. So you see this step by step, and again, keeping the feast November 1st as a solemnity. Interestingly enough, in the Byzantine East, a commemoration of all of the saints was more ancient than in the Latin Christian West, beginning back in the 4th century. And so the Byzantine emperors established it and the patriarchs, and so the Feast of All Saints in Orthodox and Byzantine Catholic Christianity is celebrated on the Sunday after Pentecost. There's no November celebration of All Saints at Our Lady of Fatima Church over here. It's the Feast of All Saints on the Sunday after Pentecost Sunday. And that Sunday commemorates not only all of the saints, the same way the Latin West does, but commemorates them within the particular context of the local church. So, for example, because we're the Russian Byzantine Catholic Church at Our Lady of Fatima, and the same with the Cathedral up the street, Russian Orthodox, the Feast of All Saints in general is celebrated with a particular commemoration of all the saints of Russia on the first Sunday after Pentecost Sunday. And that's the same with the local celebrations throughout the Byzantine East. All of the saints of Mount Athos, all of the saints of Syria, all of the saints of Turkey, Istanbul, etc. So that celebration goes back even further than in the Latin West. But what the Latin West celebration does is it takes and tries to Christianize the autumn harvest festival and the sense of spirit exorcism and appeasing the dead, which was found both in Celtic and Roman culture going back 1,000 years before Christianity. And what it then becomes then is All Hallows Tide. All Hallows Tide. We have Paschal Tide in the Latin West, which is Easter Tide, meaning that period of 50 days from Easter, from Pascha or Easter to Pentecost, 50 days, the whole Paschal or Easter season. We have the Christmas Tide, the Christmas season, both East and West, which is from Christmas Day itself to Epiphany. Then they developed the notion of All Hallows Tide, which would be All Hallows, or saints, the hallowed or the sanctified. All Hallows solemnity, November 1st, would begin with Vespers, or evening prayer of the night before, making it what? All Hallows Eve. And All Hallows Eve just simply means All Hallows evening prayer. And a corruption of that through immigrants coming to the United States became All Halloween. Instead of Eve or evening, just simply became Halloween. But what was brought in with the immigrants, German and British, Irish, all these various, because all of the cultures, I won't go into all of the Eastern European and German and Irish and other cultures, what they brought with them was these two realities. The autumn, the end of a season and the beginning of another one, that in-between stage that opens the gateway to a unique moment of encounter with the spirits of the dead. And how do we respond to that? How do we handle that? We run from them, we appease them, we masquerade as them, or from a Christian perspective, we honor them if they truly are indeed martyrs, or in general saints, general universal saints and local saints. All of that then led to the notion of Christianizing the Feast of the Dead, not only in terms of the saints, but of those who are departed, all of the dead. And so some in Christian theology are journeying to God after death, who have not yet arrived at the fullness of spiritual transformation, purification, that transforming union of love of which the great mystics speak, which is a period of purification and transformation, not punitive, not punishment, but transformation and fullness of receptivity to receive the beatifying union with God. And so these souls in this journey are commemorated and celebrated and prayed for. And so the church, the Christian church, both East and West, has always considered it with biblical foundation to be a good thing to pray for the dead. In fact, an obligation. And so the notion of extending All Saints to All Souls, making this All Hallow Tide, Halloween, the Eve, All Hallows Eve, All Saints Day itself, and then the next day, All Souls, began to develop in the Middle Ages. In the Latin West, it was basically a Benedictine feast. The great Abbey of Cluny, Benedictine Reforming Abbey, and all of the Benedictine monastic communities that were daughter foundations of the Cluniac Reform began to celebrate this All Souls Day on November 1st. And then later on, certainly by the 13th century, it had been approved by Rome as a universal feast of the Latin West. Interestingly enough, the Anglican Communion, after the separation from Rome, the Church of England, retained all of these elements and still have a commemoration not only of All Saints, but of All Souls. Even Martin Luther, the Lutheran Church, and those that sprang from Lutheranism will celebrate All Saints as all of those who have lived the Christian life. So it's a Latin Western tradition to have All Hallows Tide the evening before, the Solemnity of All Saints, and then the following day, All Souls. The East, the Byzantine East, had again jumped the gun. They had the celebration of All Souls, of All Saints, before the Latin West. They also were always celebrating All Souls early on. So in the Byzantine East, there are a number of All Souls Day, not just one. In the Latin West, in the Roman Church, you have November 2nd. In the Byzantine East, every Saturday, first Saturday, is a commemoration of the souls of the dead. So when I do the first Saturday Divine Liturgy at Our Lady of Fatima, that's a mini All Souls Day every month. That Divine Liturgy is celebrated for all of the departed. All of the departed. So when I put the particles on the discos, those of you who have been, most of you have here, that's a commemoration of all the souls of the departed. And the second Saturday before Great Lent begins is an All Souls Day. The first Saturday of Great Lent, the second Saturday of Great Lent, and the third Saturday of Great Lent are specific commemorations of All Souls as well. So all of those Saturdays of Lent, Great Lent, and all of the first Saturdays of the month throughout the year, and the first Saturday and the Saturday before Pentecost is All Souls. So there's an incredible richness in the Byzantine Christian tradition, Orthodox and Byzantine Catholic, of focusing on commemorating and praying for liturgical prayer, especially for the souls of the departed. And so when people say, oh, the Orthodox doesn't believe in doing that, well, you can always tell what the Orthodox believe by the liturgy. The liturgy speaks for itself. There are a number of commemorations throughout the year. And remember that Saturday before Pentecost Sunday, so that's All Souls. The Sunday after Pentecost Sunday in the Byzantine Rite is what? All Saints. So you have their own celebration, but outside of the traditions in the West, which they did not have, which was the joining of autumn with the focus on the spirits. That's peculiar to Western Christianity. It's what they inherited from Rome, and especially from the ancient Celtic, what we now call Irish and British traditions. All Saints is the Sunday after Pentecost Sunday. It's called All Saints, and it's celebrated for all the saints universally and also for particular cultures. So, for example, the Russian tradition will say All Saints, and in particular, all the saints of Russia. So on the first Sunday of Pentecost, I celebrate all saints and a special mention of all the saints of Russia in the Russian Christian tradition. St. Sergei of Radonezh and St. Alexis and Seraphim of Sarov and Vladimir and Cyril and Methodius, and all those saints that we commemorate separately throughout the year are celebrated. Anthony and Theodosius, the caves of Kiev, all of those saints are commemorated collectively on that day, first Sunday after Pentecost. So how did we get from this to Halloween? Well, we have this juxtaposition, this interrelationship in the United States of America of the Christian element, the Eastern element, the Western element, because you had Eastern European immigrants coming, and you had Western, German and Irish especially coming, and they're bringing their own traditions. And then you have what? Hispanic culture as well. So you have the Aztec tradition, which is inherited and Christianized in a variety of complex ways with Dia de los Muertos. And that, in its own right, within the Aztec culture, brings in not so much a focus on autumn, but simply a commemoration of the souls. And that was baptized, Christianized by the friars, the missionaries, with Jesuits, Dominicans, and mostly Franciscans who evangelized to Mexico in the 16th century. And so to this day then, even in secular portions of Mexico, by that I mean those that would be, say, public schools that have no affiliation anymore denominationally with Roman Catholicism, they're still allowed to have the ofrenda, the table, the little altar that is set up to commemorate all of the dead. So in a Mexican household, even those that aren't practicing Catholic or Christian, they still have this notion of commemorating the dead. this sense that somehow this is a period, this is a time, that gateway period, where the boundary between life and death is somehow thin enough, the boundary between heaven and earth is thin enough that there is access to the spirits of the dead. And how people respond to that varies from culture to culture. So it's semi-religious, it's semi-local cultural custom, but simply to set up an altar. Certainly there might be statues of saints, the Blessed Virgin Mary, the candles, but then you have the pictures of your loved ones, the pictures of the dead. And there are offerings to the dead, the fruit, the candy, the baskets of bread and wine and whatnot. Whatever they liked to sort of, again, this notion, the ancient notion of appeasing the dead by giving them what they want to make sure you're going to be guarded and protected rather than haunted. And added to that, ofrenda, the little altar, which even in public schools is allowed in Mexico, the visit to the cemetery, the Day of the Dead. This is very important in the Philippines, where the whole culture goes to the cemetery, the family goes to the cemetery, bringing gifts, bringing offerings, and the altar as well can be an option in families, where there is an image, candles, a commemoration, and gift offerings that would include food that would be especially appropriate to the autumnal harvest season. And so again, this whole concept that seems to be universal throughout the cultures, Eastern European and Slav and Byzantine and Aztec and Filipino and Celtic and German and Roman, Italian, that somehow this season is an in-between time in which we have access to those who have gone beyond. And a secular perspective, even in a pre-Christian era, somehow senses this and has a sense that the souls of the dead are not annihilated, but are encountered in a way that requires some kind of a response. The notion of dressing up as the dead, of appeasing them by putting food out on the doorway and whatnot, this is coupled again with this notion in later British culture and custom, and Irish as well, of guising and souling. And that's where, when the immigrants came to the United States, the idea of doing this, or a version of this, occurs on All Hallows Eve, Halloween, October 31st. That's the time when you go out and relive what the Celtics celebration was all about between October 31st and November 1st. That's the special time when access to the dead is available. That's the special time when you disguise yourself as one of them, become one of them in order to not be haunted by them, or to haunt others, if you will. Trick or treat. The tricks became particularly focused on in the beginning part of Britain and British history, and then that was carried over to the United States, where, TPing, or putting furniture on the roofs of houses and whatnot, sometimes even violent expressions of the celebration became a problem in the United States at the end of the 19th century until the mid-20th century. And then there was a movement to, especially through the advertisement agencies, to redirect Halloween and to refocus it through advertisement to become a more user-friendly, family-focused trick or treat. So the trick was simply, here I am dressed as a spook or a goblin, the dead, or a witch. Witches were a particular part of Celtic culture too, where, the idea of the powerful woman who had wisdom, that sort of jarred the culture at the time. And so there was a pejorative notion, and the witch became this sort of horrible figure and animals associated with witches, not only in pre-Christian times, but throughout the Middle Ages. Black cats, for example, and bats and that sort of thing. These became the costumes the children would wear without even realizing why they were wearing it. But they were going back to and recovering all these subliminal messages in the collective unconscious for 3,000 years. And then to receive the candy was simply a way of combining the candy and the food that people would originally use to leave outside their door to distract the dead from going in. That instead became combined with the British custom of guising and souling. You guised, in a disguise, you performed, you did a lyric or a song or whatever, and then you got food in response. That got translated into trick or treat, and you get candy instead, So you have this juxtaposition of All Hallows Tide becoming a period where the Christian and the pagan elements interweave, especially through centuries of development, Christianization, multicultural combinations through the immigrants, and then how the United States eventually settled on a kind of what we would call today the American version of Halloween, which really dates only to about the 1950s. Before that, there was a wider variety. But you can begin to see where witches tie in, where bobbing for apples ties in, where black cats and costumes and food and the notion of autumn and the spirits all tie in to a time which is also, from a Christian perspective, the celebration of all of the saints. And after the eve of that, with Vespers, Halloween Vespers is October 31st, and then the following day after All Saints in the West, the commemoration of all the departed, or All Souls Day. In the Catholic faith, Benedict XV would apply in the 1920s an indulge so that priests are allowed to actually celebrate 3 masses on that day for the departed, for the plenary indulgence for the departed, and one for the intention of the priest and one for the intention of the Pope, the Holy Father. So that's a particular custom that Catholics are aware of, gaining the indulgence for the dead. But that's relatively recent. That only goes back to the 1920s, the pontificate of Benedict XV. So that's Halloween in a nutshell. It's fascinating. This is obviously a time in the collective conscious, the psyche of cultures, that's this gateway, this in between heaven and earth, life and death, summer and winter, light and darkness, and how you navigate that in the collective unconscious, and how the church takes that and tries to transform it into a focus on, yes, we believe all of that, but we believe it in the mystery of Christ. So that we're not just talking about floating spirits, we're talking about the dead who are either saints in heaven or who are journeying on their way there, and who we commemorate and for whom we pray as we celebrate their lives. All saints and all souls, both in the East and in the West in the Christian liturgical tradition. So it's a fascinating time, yeah. So next time someone rings your bell and says, trick or treat, you can say, do you have an hour? I can tell you all about what that means. Or you could just give them some M&Ms. So, isn't that fascinating? Any questions or any is it clear?
That's a lot of research. I can't wait to tell my 8-year-old granddaughter.
Yeah. Yeah.
All the children, they're really into the spirit.
Yeah.
Zombies and all of that.
But that you're going back 3,000 years. We're in Rome, May 13th, and May 13th was the spirits were around, and we have to do exorcisms, and this is pre-Christian. And then the Pope takes that feast, and he makes that, May 13th, the first
commemoration of the martyrs. And then the next pope, that was Boniface IV. The next pope, Gregory III, extends that to the saints, all of the saints, but only local. And then Gregory IV, that was Gregory III, Gregory IV, a century later, extends it to the universal church of the Latin West. Again, the East had already, back to the 4th century, celebrated their Feast of the Saints on the Sunday after Pentecost. And then the Feast of All Souls for the West emerges from the Benedictine reforms of the 11th century in the West, and then gradually get spread through Charlemagne and through King Louis. They get Pepin, they get spread throughout the Latin West and approved definitively by Rome for the universal Western Church by the 13th century. So you have All Hallows Tide, Halloween, All Hallows Eve, All Hallows, All Saints, and then All Souls the following day.
I never knew it was so about.
Yeah.
Maybe it was just a children's holiday or whatever.
Yeah, no, it's a very ancient, rich, complex, multi-layered combination of the secular and the religious and of the multiple themes of harvest and the spirits. The very idea that harvest time, see, the winter's beginning, and they begin reflecting on what is winter? What is winter? Winter is the time of death. Winter is the time when we wait in darkness. And then they start contemplating their own mortality, and they begin to see this as the pivotal time, the gateway time between October 31st and Samhain, which is the Celtic word for November, where there's a gateway and access to the dead. Where they
Maybe are a little bit down when the dark enters in, especially on the early side.
Right.
Generally, just don't feel that way.
Right.
I mean, that's always with me. Anyway.
So it's what every individual is experiencing psychologically is the collective unconscious psyche, Jung would say, the collective unconscious psyche of the whole. Each of us is the whole human race, as it were, a microcosm. We're connected to all those generations of people, ancient farmers who would have felt the light's gone, summer's over, whatever I have from the harvest is it, and the winter, and then they would think of that in terms of mortality and access to the spirits of the dead, and the opposing feelings that would have, intrigued by it, but also afraid of it.
Time of grief.
Yeah.
Going into the underworld.
But also being drawn to it. Look how people are drawn to Halloween. They're fascinated by death, and at the same time they're terrified of it, want to avoid it. Samhain is, I believe, Sawhein.
Actually, modern day pagans
That's,
celebrate
yeah, Sawhein.
or Samhain is another spelling.
Yes, that's another spelling, yeah. But it's pronounced Samhain. And it's the time between October 31st and the 1st, November 1st. And that was the feast.
But the word Halloween is actually the Christian word, meaning
All hallowed means all saints. So what obviously happened was they took Samhain and Christianized it. Because it's not just arbitrary coincidence that they've placed this on the same date. And they've also combined the Roman celebration of the pagan goddess of harvest and the period where they were celebrating the dead on May 13th as well. Because the first feast of all martyrs was in Rome was May 13th, and that was later transferred by Gregory III to November 1st.
Was the Aztec Day of the Dead at this time of year always?
Yes.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yep.
It's at the same time.
It's all the cultures are doing the same thing. Yeah.
It's fascinating.
Yeah. Thank you for being here. So what is she going to be for Halloween? These doors are the only ones that are open, yeah. What is she going to be for Halloween?
She's actually going to be a medieval princess.
Oh, that's nice.
Not a zombie goddess or something. I know.